Okay, so let's start 4.3 soil composition and properties. So we've talked about how soil forms, and something else that's really important is understanding what makes up soil and what kind of chemical, biological properties that soil has. Okay, so let me go ahead and turn this into slideshow really quickly. Okay, so why is it important to understand soil composition and properties? Well, first of all, the particle size and the composition of the soil both affect the porosity, the permeability, and how fertile the soil is to grow plants or crops. So we've developed a variety of methods to test soil based on all of the chemical, physical, and biological properties of soil, like I mentioned earlier. Okay. And we use these tests or these methods to determine that exact composition of soil, like what are the different particles that make up soil, and how do the properties impact things like the amount of irrigation that we're providing for crops, especially, or even our yards, our lawns, and what are the fertilizer requirements for those areas as well. So, if we're trying to grow plants in areas, I think it's what I don't think it actually is very important to understand that exact composition. And we're actually in our lab going to be figuring out the exact composition of a soil sample. And so we'll do that um, when we get into the lab. Okay, let's move on. All right, so understanding the different types of soil. If you look at this picture over to the right, you'll notice that we have three different types of soil particles. So particles that make up the soil. And so those consist of sand, salt, and clay. And you can see here on the microscope, when you look under a microscope at 10 times magnification, this is what sand looks like. This is what silt looks like, so much smaller particles. But then if you notice, this is actually at 1,000 times. We have to magnify clay to 1,000 times to even see the particles. So that's just shows you the size difference. Sand is much larger than clay. Okay, and so if I was looking at the particle size from biggest to smallest, I would say sand is the biggest, silt is the medium sized particle, and then clay is the smallest. So, soil texture is the percent of sand, silt, and clay that makes up a type of soil. And this always equals 100%. I'm going to show you how you figure this out, I think, on the next slide. So, we'll talk about that more in just a few. But sand is always bigger and it has bigger pores. Pores are empty. I mean, think of pores in your skin, they're empty spaces within your skin. Particles have the exact same thing, these empty spaces between particles. This allows both air and water to creep into those areas very easily. Clay has the smallest pores, so it's very hard for both air and water to enter clay. Clay is a very heavy, dense soil. Okay, and then lastly, we have on this slide, we have porosity. Porosity is the amount of pore space that a soil has. So there's more sand. If there's more sand in a soil, it is more porous and has a higher porosity. Porosity, that just means that it's easier for the water and the air to enter when we use the term porosity. Clay is has tiny particles, and it's less porous or has less porosity, which means it's very, very hard for water and air to enter clay. All right, so here's the chart that you need to be able to use. I know on your unit test, I believe, thinking back, there's two questions where you have to physically calculate the type of soil or determine the type of soil based on the different particles that are within that soil. So make sure that you understand how to use this. So we're going to practice this right now. So if I said that the soil that I have is 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay, what type of soil would you say I have? Well, what you do is you always start with sand on the bottom. So if I start down here with sand, it has 40%. So I draw a line to where sand and silt, here's 40% silt, intersect. They intersect right here at this red dot. And then I go over, and that should tell me how much clay I have. So that's 20%, that matches up. So the type of soil that has 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay is a loam soil. Um, So the kind of some tips here of using the soil texture chart I sort of already showed you, but start with sand on the bottom, move to where the sand and the silt intersect or where they meet on that triangle, then go straight over to clay. Make sure that those three numbers add up to 100%, and then that tells you the type of soil you have. All right, so we could practice this again. This is what we're going to be doing in the lab. If you see this picture at the bottom, there's a mason jar filled with soil. We've added water and some sort of detergent to break down the bonds or the oil within the soil. And then this is a 20% clay, 35% silt, and 45% sand. So if I go to 45% sand, and 35% silt, that's about right here. Yeah, about right there on this line, actually. I go over and it's 20% clay. Again, this is a loam soil, so it's the exact same soil that we had before. So we're actually going to do this mason jar test, so we'll talk about that in more details when we do the lab. And my internet must be not wanting to advance my slide. Let me back out of here and show you. And I just noticed that this has a practice problem on here where they gave you 30% sand, 20% silt, and 50% clay. And it gave you a totally different answer. But you can practice how they got this answer if you stop the notes and see if you get the exact same answer. Okay, let's move on to slides. If we have trouble with that again, I'll have to just use the online PowerPoint and not go into slideshow mode. Okay, so porosity, again, these three types of soil textures and how water holding capacity relates to those different features of the soil. So again, porosity is the space within a soil, more sand, more porous. Permeability is how easy water drains through a soil. So that's an important term to know. How quickly does the water drain? That has to do with the porosity. If it's more porous, sand, for instance, it's going to be more permeable. Water's going to run through it much more quickly. And then there's also water holding capacity. That's another characteristic that you need to know. This is how well water actually holds or retains that water within the soil. So more porous is more permeable. It has a lower water holding capacity. Sand cannot hold water very long. If we were to fill up 3 containers with sand, silt, and clay, and we filled up the same amount of water, it would take approximately 1 hour for the sand to drain the water. It would take about 100 days for the silt to drain the water. So you can see that this has a greater water holding capacity. And then clay, it would take 100 years. So clay, for that reason, clay is actually used to line landfills because we don't want the liquids that form in landfills to drain from the landfills. Those can actually be fairly toxic. So we want that water to stay in a landfill. So they use what they call a clay liner or a liner that happens to be made out of clay. And a pretty thick layer. They should use a pretty thick layer according to regulations to line that landfill so that water doesn't actually leach out of it or leak out of it. Leach, you'll hear that term. That just pretty much means the same thing as leak. Okay, so what is the effect of these things on soil fertility? Soil that's too sandy actually drains water much too quickly for roots and it dries out very fast. So there needs to be like a good balance between the amount of sand, silt, and clay that we find in arable soil or agricultural land. And then clay is actually too heavy. It's a very heavy soil and it doesn't let the water drain. So it can actually waterlog or suffocate. It like overwaters plants. So that's not a good thing either. So again, there needs to be this nice balance between the type of soil particles that we have in a soil for it to grow crops really well. So the actual like ideal soil to grow plants is a loam soil because it has that nice combination of sand, silt, and clay. So it's mostly sand and silt with some clay mixed in because we do want to hold the soil in, especially during drought conditions, or hold the water in during drought conditions, but we also don't want it to waterlog the plant and kill the plant. Okay, so soil fertility. Other things that impact soil fertility or the ability of soil to support plant growth are the types of nutrients that are there. And so when we're talking about nutrients, in our case, in apes, we're mostly going to concentrate on nitrogen and phosphorus. Potassium is also important. These other things are also important, but nitrogen and phosphorus is what we're going to like really focus on. That's what you need to memorize. It's what you need to write down. And so factors that actually increase soil nutrients are the organic matter that's there, the humus that's there, how many decomposers, the clay that's in the soil, and then any bases. Like sometimes they'll put calcium carbonate, which is limestone, on crops to lower the acidity in a soil. If there's too much acid or the acidity or the pH of the soil is too acidic, plants don't grow well. So farmers will actually spread limestone, or which mostly is made out of calcium carbonate, on the soil, which is a base, which raises the pH, brings it to a more neutral or slightly basic pH. Factors that decrease soil nutrients: having too much acidic soil, excessive rainfall, excessive farming, and not farming in a sustainable way. So farmers have to be very, very intelligent about and very educated about their soil. And then topsoil erosion. In improper farming can also lead to a lot of erosion, which is not a good thing. So again, farmers need to really think about sustainability and be good to their soil and know the proper techniques to keep. There's a lot of research that goes into that if anyone's interested in agriculture. Okay, water is also important. And so factors that increase the water holding capacity is aerating the soil. That improves the bacteria that live in the soil. Applying compost or organic matter to the soil, increasing the clay content if there's not enough clay. And then root structure. So using native plants, actually, they have better root systems, which improves the water holding capacity. Having more roots for plants in the soil, or from plants in the soil, actually increases how much water is held. And then factors that decrease it is compacting the soil too much. We're going to be doing a lab later where we talk about soil compaction and how that impacts plant growth. Topsoil erosion, sand, and then root loss. Okay, so here's some different characteristics and tests of soil quality. I'm not going to sit here and read all of these to you. We're actually going to be looking at this in our lab, but this might be a good time to pause the video so that you can look at these. I would probably write these down. Maybe not necessarily how you test it, but maybe what it tells you. So write down what the characteristic is and then what it tells you. I think those are the important things here. Okay, here's your practice FRQ. So identify and describe one test that can be conducted on a soil sample. Explain how the results of that test could allow you to give advice to a farmer when they're trying to grow crops in their soil. Again, those answers for those FRQs can be found on OneNote. And then in our next notes, we're going to be talking about section 4.4, which is the atmosphere. Okay, that's it. If you have any questions about any of this, make sure you talk to me in class or during Pathways. See you later.